Now, the Crown Prosecution Service is to apply on an unconscious bias test in order to be anti-racist, because research suggests that black suspects are more likely to be charged than white people when accused of the same crime. Prosecutors are to apply these new rules as a part of a drive to eliminate unconscious racial bias. Guidelines will be introduced after research suggested black suspects were more likely to be charged than white people when accused of the same crime. They say that a new code for Crown prosecutors would seek to eliminate racial bias in decision-making and tackle high levels of disproportionality in the justice system. Well, Stephen Parkinson, who's the Director of Public Prosecutions, this is a man who said he didn't know what non-crime hate incidents were a couple of weeks ago. He said the decisions we make as prosecutors have a profound impact on the lives of victims and defendants. Yeah, I think that's pretty obvious, Stephen. It is vital we hold ourselves to the highest standards of accountability and transparency. As Director of Public Prosecutions, I'm doing just that. For us to bring meaningful change, we must scrutinise and challenge how we work. We have undertaken a detailed and rigorous research programme, and it is apparent from the data that there have been racial disparities in our legal decision-making. This is clearly unacceptable, and I apologise both personally and on behalf of the organisation. I deeply regret that this has occurred. Although the ultimate decision of guilt or innocence is for the courts, I'm determined the Crown Prosecution Service will eliminate any possible bias in our decision making. Our systems and processes need to change to identify and tackle disparity, and our ambitious action plan is an important step towards achieving this. Well, let's talk to Dr. Rakib Ehsan, who's a political commentator. Rakib, is this essentially saying that everyone's a bit racist?
Well, I'm not really sure what it says, and I'm not really sure what the CPS intend to do with this so-called breakthrough data. I think that actually, if you look at certain cases, it appears to me that minorities have been the beneficiaries of preferential treatment when it comes to our criminal justice system and law and order
what makes you say
institutions. That? Well, I think that there's a variety of things. I think that if you look at how, in terms of policing of recent demonstrations, I think that there's been certainly discrepancies there. If you look at Notting Hill Carnival, for example, if you look at the level of violence and criminality there, I would have thought that the law and order institutions would have been really issuing quite strong action on that front. But I suspect that if it was a St. George's Day parade, for example, I think they'd have been more willing to do so. I think that there have been demonstrations, whether you look at BLM demonstrations a few years back, but also pro-Palestine demonstrations. And I've said before on your show, Peter, that I firmly support the cause of Palestinian statehood, but I certainly think that aggressively anti-Semitic elements of those demonstrations have been seriously under-policed. So I think that when it comes to law and order, I think that it's far more complicated than some people portray it to be.
Well, and I think that doesn't Stephen Parkinson, as one of the most senior sort of law implementers in our society, know about this? I mean, in 2021, research published by the University of Leeds found white British suspects have the lowest charge rate compared to all other ethnicities, with a 69.9% of cases resulting in a charge. Ethnic minority suspects had a charge rate of between 77.3 and 81.3%, depending on their heritage. My thought on this, Rakib, is if you break it down in lots of different ways, you can make all sorts of assumptions, and causation doesn't necessarily mean correlation. And also, there are far more poor people who are ethnic minorities in this country than rich people. And actually, if you're poorer, you're more likely to be drawn into crime in some way. So there are lots and lots of reasons around this that are actually a lot more than race.
Oh, no, absolutely. I think that, firstly, that term there, ethnic minority, I think there'll be a great deal of variation within that wide ethnic minority sample. I think that the rates there among Black Caribbeans may be very different to the rates among people of Chinese heritage or indeed Indian heritage. So
and we can't just lump them all together, because that in itself is racist, I find.
Absolutely, and you'd be missing some very serious group-based differences if you were to lump them together in one category. And I think that you make a good point there about socioeconomic deprivation. Now, being socioeconomically deprived isn't an excuse to engage in criminality.
Totally agree.
The reality is that there is a connection there, that if you live in a deprived area, and especially if you live in a community where there's high rates of fatherlessness, something that doesn't get talked about at all when we have these kind of conversations,
correct,
then you are more likely to be drawn into gang-related activity and indeed become a member of a gang. And that in turn heightens the chances of you being involved directly in criminal activity. So I think that there's lots of things that we need to discuss here if we want to talk very seriously about racial and ethnic disparities. I think we need to be honest about the drivers here.
Yeah, I think you're right, actually, and I wonder whether this is just political correctness or wokeness by the Crown Prosecution Service, because if you're going to charge someone with a crime, you've got to know what you go through a very rigorous process, don't you, of working out. I mean, once it gets to the CPS level, the police have to feel that there is evidence or that would mean that they can arrest, that they can push it forward and send it to the Crown Prosecution Service, who then decide. And they're dealing with what they get, aren't they? Because if they get 80% of crimes from ethnic minorities and 20% from white people, and charge 20% of their crimes against white people and 80% of their crimes against, I'm just making these statistics up, but let's say that they do that. I mean, they're dealing with what they get. And what I often find in this situation is that we blame people at the end of the system. We blame universities, for example, for taking, far more people from private schools, for example. Well, maybe they've had a better education than state schools, for example. I would never want to advocate private schools necessarily, but there are a lot of aspects of this where the people who are evaluated are at the end of the process of a system of society that they haven't broken, but they're meant to retrospectively fix it. Do you see what I mean?
No, absolutely. And I think another point is that I'd imagine that when it comes to bringing about charges and indeed prosecutions, I think past criminal history may come into it as well. So I think there's a variety of factors here at play. And I just think that just reducing it to race it is unhelpful. And I think I'd make the point that I think even when you're looking at this research, I think people who are connected to the research did say that it is very clear that these prosecutions, the charges that were brought against black people, there was evidence there for that to take place. So I think that what we have to really see is if we're looking at racial and ethnic disparities, when it comes to various, and it differs from crime to crime as well, I think that we have to really see what are the key social, economic, and indeed cultural drivers that may be at play.
I mean, there is the case, of course, that there will be people who will argue that there is evidence of unconscious bias. I mean, my point, the racists I know are generally very consciously biased, and the whole notion of unconscious bias to me is something that is actually a bit patronising, that you don't even realise you're doing it. I wonder what you think of the concept of unconscious bias yourself, Rakib.
Well, I think if I'm being honest, I think that all human beings, to a degree, they have certain biases and prejudices. I think that anyone who said that I'm completely free of bias and prejudice, I'd have to question how truly human they are, and I'd have to question how honest they are. I think this is ultimately about managing your biases and prejudices. But I think the point here is, when it comes to the Met Police, for example, there's a great deal of talk about racism, how it can be a more anti-racist institution. The reality is it's a badly performing institution because it doesn't do the bread and butter. But ultimately, it's just that it doesn't do particularly when it comes to bread and butter policing. And I think that doesn't go for just for the Met, but I think that goes for police forces across the country. It's something that we discussed the other day, that the de facto decriminalisation of shoplifting, for example, on high streets, theft, burglary in local communities. And I think that that's affecting, especially in cities and urban areas, that's affecting people from a variety of backgrounds. So I want to see the restoration of neighbourhood policing. I want to see the police doing well when it comes to the bread and butter of keeping local communities as safe as possible.
Rakib, thank you. That's Rakib Ehsan, Dr. Rakib Ehsan, political commentator. That is about the Crown Prosecution Service applying an unconscious bias test in order to be anti-racist, in its view anyway. Lots of people getting in touch about all sorts of things. Gary has been in touch about John McTurnan there as well, who says, just listen to this Labour mouthpiece claiming that the reason Louise Hay has to resign is because the Tories are playing the man, not the ball. What nonsense. If you weaponise integrity when you're in opposition like Labour, you shouldn't put yourself in a position where your own lack of integrity can swim round and bite you in the backside